Walk away from that plane and I'll wire you $1 million tonight." The billionaire offered the single dad $1 million to walk away. In front of investors, pilots, and cameras, he treated a grease-stained worker like a problem money could erase. But the single dad didn't argue, beg, or flinch. He answered so calmly the entire terminal seemed to forget how to breathe. Because real worth never needs luxury to prove itself. Before I show you the exact moment when the runway alarms turned that humiliation into the billionaire's worst mistake, stay with me. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. The hangar lights glowed against polished marble floors meant for executives, not mechanics. Guests in tailored suits leaned over balcony rails to watch the strange standoff on the runway. A child somewhere behind the crowd asked why the worker wasn't taking the money. The answer was standing in oil-stained boots beneath a jet worth more than most neighborhoods. He looked once toward the cockpit windows where frightened faces pressed against glass. Then he looked back at the billionaire and simply shook his head. The silence stretched tight as a cable ready to snap. Elias Rowan wiped his hands slowly on a rag already dark with grease. He wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the warning tone still whining inside the jet's avionics bay, and about the fuel lines trembling under pressure nobody else seemed to notice. Across from him, Adrian Vale stood surrounded by people who never heard the word no. The billionaire's smile tightened as cameras drifted closer. "Listen," he said impatiently, lowering his voice but not his arrogance. "Take the offer, step aside, let professionals handle the situation." A murmur rolled through the guests above. To them it looked generous. To Elias it sounded like someone trying to buy time he didn't have. Another alarm chirped from the aircraft, sharper this time. Several pilots exchanged worried glances. The mechanic tilted his head, listening the way musicians listen for the wrong note in an orchestra. He stepped closer to the landing gear despite security moving nervously beside him. "You really should move back," one guard muttered. Elias barely heard him. A faint vibration shivered through the metal frame under his palm. Wrong rhythm. Wrong system cycle, the kind of pattern he hadn't heard since another runway years ago far from cameras and champagne. Behind him, Vale exhaled loudly, patience evaporating. "Last chance," the billionaire said. $1 million for 10 seconds of common sense." Some guests laughed softly. The mechanic straightened and finally faced him fully. Rain began ticking against the glass walls of the terminal above. Inside the cockpit, a woman pounded once against the window. Fear travels faster than jet fuel when people realize something isn't right. Elias felt that wave moving through the hangar. He also knew exactly what came next if nobody interrupted the chain reaction building inside that aircraft. He thought briefly of his daughter waiting upstairs with a paper cup of hot chocolate. Leela believed her dad fixed things. Not just machines, problems, promises. The mechanic inhaled slowly, smelling fuel, rain, and electrical heat mixing together. Then he looked back toward the billionaire who still expected obedience. "No," Elias said quietly. The word carried farther than anyone expected. Up on the balcony, a conversation died mid-sentence. Vale blinked as if recalculating a deal. But this wasn't a negotiation anymore. Another alarm screamed from the aircraft. This time everyone heard it. Elias turned back toward the jet, already moving. Because $1 million couldn't stop what was about to happen, and he was the only person on that runway who knew it. The mechanic grabbed a maintenance ladder and rolled it toward the aircraft's open service panel. Security shouted behind him, but hesitation weakened their voices. They had just watched a worker refuse a fortune. People don't do that unless they know something others don't. Rain thickened outside, tapping the runway lights like nervous fingers. Inside the aircraft, the frightened passengers were starting to shout. The sound carried through the thin metal skin of the jet. He climbed the ladder 2 steps at a time. Behind him, Vale watched the mechanic reach the avionics hatch. For the first time that night, the billionaire didn't look powerful. He looked uncertain. Because the man he tried to buy was now the only one moving toward the danger, and somewhere above the balcony crowd began to realize the same thing. The quiet single dad they laughed at might be the only person who could save them all, but none of them yet understood why his answer had silenced the room. They were about to. When the panel opened, everything changed in that instant. The avionics hatch creaked open under Elias's grip, rainwater sliding down the metal panel as he lifted it. Inside the compartment, a maze of cables glowed faintly beneath warning lights blinking in uneven rhythm. The sound he'd heard earlier, the subtle vibration, was louder now, like a heartbeat skipping in a body under stress. Behind him, voices rose across the runway. Hey, you can't just open that." One airport technician shouted. Elias leaned closer, ignoring the panic. His fingers brushed along a cluster of connectors, feeling the temperature through thin rubber gloves. Too hot. Way too hot. From the balcony above, Adrian Vale's irritation had hardened into disbelief. What exactly does he think he's doing? The billionaire demanded. One of the aviation consultants beside him adjusted his glasses nervously. He might be checking the avionics relay, the man muttered. Vale scoffed. A ground mechanic? But the consultant didn't answer. Because the mechanic wasn't moving like someone guessing. He was moving like someone remembering. Below, Elias traced a cable path deeper into the panel. A warning tone pulsed through the aircraft again, shrill, insistent. He muttered under his breath. "Yeah, I hear you." Footsteps approached quickly. 2 airport engineers rushed across the slick runway carrying diagnostic tablets. One of them shouted up to him. "Sir, you need to step down. That system's controlled through the cockpit." Elias glanced over his shoulder. Then why are the cockpit alarms cycling through 3 different failures? The younger engineer froze. What? The mechanic tapped the side of the open panel. Hydraulic pressure alert, then avionics relay, then fuel line imbalance. He paused. That order shouldn't happen unless something upstream is overheating. The 2 engineers exchanged a confused look. From the balcony, Vale folded his arms impatiently. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Get him off that ladder." Security started toward Elias. But just as they reached him, the jet shuddered. A deep metallic tremor rippled through the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, someone screamed. The engineers looked at each other again, this time pale. One whispered, "That shouldn't happen during startup." Elias didn't turn around. Exactly. He reached deeper into the avionics bay, carefully adjusting a relay connection. The trembling eased slightly. Above, murmurs spread across the wealthy guests gathered along the glass railing. They had come for champagne and charity speeches. Instead, they were watching a mechanic stabilize a multi-million-dollar jet. Vale frowned, sensing the shift in the room. He hated shifts he didn't control. "Enough," he said sharply. He grabbed a microphone from the event podium and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. A minor technical issue is being handled." He gestured toward the runway. "Our certified engineers will take over shortly." Down below, the 2 engineers looked up at Elias again. Neither of them moved to climb the ladder, because neither of them understood what he was already diagnosing. Elias studied the blinking lights again. His brow tightened. "Not minor," he murmured. Another vibration passed through the plane. He closed his eyes briefly, listening. A faint memory stirred. A runway at dusk. A jet engine screaming. A warning pattern exactly like this one, back when he wore a different uniform, back when people didn't look past him, He opened his eyes again. "Hey," he called down to the engineers. "Did anyone check the backup power regulator?" They blinked. "The what?" Elias exhaled slowly. "That explains a lot." Upstairs, Vale leaned toward the consultant again. "What's he talking about?" The man swallowed. "If the backup regulator overheats, it can send conflicting signals through the entire avionics system." Vale frowned. And the cockpit alarms won't know which failure is real." The billionaire's confidence faltered for half a second. Below, Elias carefully unclipped a cable bundle. A faint spark snapped inside the panel. The engineers jumped back. "Whoa." But the mechanic just nodded. "There you are." He tightened the connection and wiped rain from his forehead. The plane's warning tone shifted pitch. For a moment, just a moment, the alarms stopped. Silence rippled through the runway. Passengers inside the cockpit leaned toward the windows in confusion. On the balcony above, people held their breath. Vale stared down at the mechanic. What did he just do? The consultant whispered, "Stabilize the relay cycle." Vale blinked. "But you said only avionics engineers." "I did." The billionaire's gaze returned to Elias. For the first time that night, uncertainty flickered behind his confident expression. Because the mechanic he'd tried to buy off was now the only person who seemed to understand the aircraft. Down on the ladder, Elias closed the panel halfway but didn't seal it. The temporary fix wouldn't last. He knew that. And if the engineers couldn't find the overheating regulator soon, the alarms would come back worse. He climbed down from the ladder. Rain dripped from the jet's wings, splashing against the runway lights. The two engineers stepped toward him carefully. "How did you know where to look?" one asked. Elias shrugged. "Pattern recognition." The younger one frowned. You work ground maintenance." "Yep, but that kind of diagnosis usually takes." He stopped mid-sentence. Because he realized something. Elias hadn't used a scanner, hadn't checked a tablet. He'd done it by listening. The mechanic glanced up toward the balcony where his daughter stood beside the railing. Leela raised a small fist in quiet encouragement. He smiled faintly. Then he turned back to the jet. "All right," Elias said. "Now we need to find what's cooking that regulator before it melts." The engineers stared at him. And for the first time that night, they didn't see a mechanic. They saw someone leading the response. And far above them, Adrian Vale realized something even more unsettling. The man he offered $1 million to walk away hadn't even started fixing the real problem yet. Rain slid down the runway lights in long silver lines as the mechanic stepped away from the ladder. The temporary silence inside the aircraft lasted only a few seconds before another warning tone flickered faintly through the metal skin. Not loud yet, but threatening. The two engineers stood beside him, waiting. They didn't even realize they were waiting for instructions. Elias crouched near the aircraft's front landing gear and pressed his palm lightly against the metal housing again. There it was. The vibration hadn't disappeared. It had only slowed. "Regulator's still heating," he said quietly. The younger engineer rubbed the back of his neck. "But the diagnostics show stable power now." "Diagnostics read signals," Elias replied. "Heat doesn't always send signals until it's too late." The older engineer squinted at him. "How long have you been doing this?" Elias shrugged without looking up. "Long enough." Up on the balcony, Adrian Vale watched the scene with a tightening jaw. People around him were whispering now. And none of those whispers sounded impressed with him. They said he's just maintenance. "I heard he fixed the alarms already. Why would a mechanic know avionics like that?" The billionaire hated speculation when it wasn't about his success. He turned sharply toward the consultant beside him. "Why are my engineers standing around while that man plays hero?" The consultant hesitated. They might be, assessing his findings. Vale's voice dropped lower. I didn't hire them to assess mechanics. Below, Elias stood and wiped rain from his hands again. He walked slowly along the side of the jet, eyes scanning each access panel like a man reading familiar terrain. The engineers followed without realizing they had fallen into step behind him. A few security guards trailed farther back, uncertain what their role even was now. The mechanic stopped beside a smaller hatch near the wing root. He crouched again and listened, not with equipment, with instinct. A faint ticking sound echoed behind the metal, too rhythmic, too steady. He exhaled. Found you. The younger engineer blinked. You can hear the regulator from here? Not the regulator, Elias said. The coolant pump that's supposed to keep it from overheating, he tapped the hatch lightly. It's stalling every few seconds. The older engineer frowned. That pump should have a failover, exactly. He stood and looked directly at them. So if the backup didn't kick in, the younger one's eyes widened. The system thinks everything's fine. While the regulator cooks itself alive, Elias finished. Above them, the balcony doors slid open. Vale had decided watching from a distance wasn't enough. He strode onto the rain-slick viewing platform surrounded by assistants. The billionaire leaned over the railing. You. Elias didn't look up immediately. He finished tightening a latch first, then he slowly straightened. Rain dotted his hair. You talking to me? Vale's tone sharpened. Yes, the mechanic who seems determined to delay this flight. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through a few guests nearby, but not many. People were starting to sense the stakes. Vale gestured impatiently. My team tells me you've been interfering with aircraft systems. Stabilizing, Elias corrected calmly. Temporary stabilization, Vale scoffed. Well, congratulations. Now step aside so trained personnel can solve the problem properly. The two engineers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Because they weren't sure they could. Elias glanced toward the cockpit windows. Inside, passengers still looked frightened. One small child was crying. The sound carried faintly through the rain. He looked back up at the billionaire. Your coolant pump is failing. Vale blinked. What? If we don't replace or bypass it, Elias continued evenly, the regulator will overheat again in about 10 minutes. The consultant beside Vale leaned forward quickly. That actually aligns with the earlier relay spike. Vale stared at him. You're agreeing with the mechanic now? I'm agreeing with the data. Down on the runway, Elias pulled a wrench from the pocket of his work belt. He spun it once in his hand, absent-mindedly. Pumps behind this panel, he said. But getting to it means cutting power to two systems first. The younger engineer swallowed. That would shut down the cockpit display for about 30 seconds, Elias said. Unless someone reroutes auxiliary current manually, the engineer blinked again. That's a military-level workaround. Elias didn't answer. Up on the balcony, Vale folded his arms. I'm not authorizing random mechanics to start cutting power to my aircraft. The rain intensified. The jet shuddered again. This time the warning tone returned with a sharper scream. Everyone flinched. The consultant's voice rose nervously. The regulator temperature is climbing again. Vale's confident posture stiffened. Below, Elias looked back at the panel calmly. Clocks running, the two engineers stared between him and the jet. Because they understood something now. None of them had time to argue about titles. They only had time to fix the plane. And right now the only person who seemed to know exactly how to do that was the man Vale had tried to pay to walk away. Elias knelt beside the hatch and placed the wrench against the bolts. Behind him the runway lights flickered against the rain. Above him the billionaire hesitated. because if the mechanic was right, the next 10 minutes might decide whether that jet left safely or exploded right there on the runway. The alarm returned like a scream tearing through metal. Passengers inside the cockpit jerked back from the windows as the warning lights burst into a frantic strobe again. The jet shuddered harder this time, a deep vibration rolling through the fuselage like thunder trapped under steel. On the balcony above, the consultant grabbed the railing. The regulator temperature just spiked again. Adrian Vale's jaw tightened. Below, Elias didn't look surprised. He tightened his grip on the wrench and began loosening the bolts on the panel covering the coolant system. 1, 2, 3. Rainwater slid down his sleeves as he worked quickly but without panic. The younger engineer crouched beside him. "You're serious about cutting the cockpit power?" "For 30 seconds, Elias said. "That's all the window we need." The engineer glanced toward the jet nervously. "If we miscalculate," Elias met his eyes, "we won't." That confidence didn't sound arrogant, it sounded practiced. Above them, Vale leaned forward again. "You will stop what you're doing immediately," the billionaire barked. Security looked down at the mechanic uncertainly. But the jet shuddered again, louder this time. A long grinding noise echoed from somewhere deep inside the aircraft. Passengers began shouting. The older engineer looked up toward the balcony. "Sir, if the coolant pump fails completely, the regulator could overload." Vale snapped. "I understand the risk." "No," the engineer said quietly. "You understand the price of the plane." Silence fell for a split second. Vale's expression darkened. Below, Elias pulled the panel loose. Steam hissed faintly from inside the compartment. The younger engineer recoiled. "That's overheating already." "Exactly," Elias said. Inside the cavity, the coolant pump vibrated violently against its mounting bracket, jerking every few seconds like a heart struggling to beat. The mechanic studied it for a moment. Then he sighed. "Pump's dying. Can we replace it?" The younger engineer asked quickly. Elias shook his head. "No spare on site." The man's face went pale. "Then what do we?" "We bypass it." The engineer blinked. "With what?" Elias reached into his tool belt again. He pulled out a short braided hose and a pair of pressure clamps. The younger engineer stared. "You carry coolant bypass equipment in a maintenance belt?" Elias shrugged. "Old habit." Up on the balcony, the consultant whispered urgently to Vale. If he reroutes the coolant flow manually, it might hold long enough to stabilize the regulator. Vale rubbed his temples. "This is absurd." But the alarms screamed again. And this time the plane's left engine coughed violently. Passengers inside the cockpit lurched sideways. The sound of panic spread across the runway. The billionaire looked down at the mechanic again. For the first time that night, he didn't see a stubborn employee. He saw the only person moving toward the problem while everyone else debated it. Below, Elias slid the bypass hose into place with precise movements. Rain soaked the back of his shirt. The engineers watched him work with growing amazement. "You've done this before," the older one murmured. Elias tightened the final clamp. "Something like it." The younger engineer hesitated. "Where?" For a brief moment, Elias didn't answer, because the sound of that failing pump had pulled a memory from somewhere deep in his mind. A desert runway, an aircraft bleeding fuel, a countdown shouted over military radios. He pushed the memory away and focused on the present. "Doesn't matter," he said quietly. He reached toward the wiring harness above the pump. "Now we cut cockpit power for 30 seconds. The younger engineer swallowed hard. "That's a big risk." Elias glanced toward the cockpit window. Inside, frightened faces looked back, including a woman clutching the armrest with white knuckles. Someone important. Someone Vale cared about. The mechanic looked back at the engineer. The bigger risk is doing nothing. Up on the balcony, Vale's voice cracked across the runway again. If you shut down that cockpit display, I will personally have you removed from this airport. Elias finally looked up. Rain streaked across his face. Then you might want to start removing people now, he said calmly. Because the regulator hits meltdown in 8 minutes. The consultant gasped quietly beside Vale. 8? The billionaire stared down at the mechanic. The man didn't look afraid, didn't look impressed, didn't even look angry. He just looked certain. Below, Elias reached for the manual override switch. The younger engineer's voice trembled. 30 seconds exactly? 30, then we bring auxiliary current online? Elias nodded. You're learning. The engineer inhaled sharply. Above them, Adrian Vale finally realized something terrifying. The mechanic he'd tried to pay to walk away wasn't improvising. He was executing a plan. A plan that sounded disturbingly familiar to the consultant beside him. The man leaned closer to Vale and whispered, That bypass method, it's used in military emergency procedures. Vale blinked. Military? The consultant nodded slowly. Yes, below, Elias's hand hovered over the override switch. The rain fell harder. Passengers inside the jet watched through the windows, and the billionaire realized something he had never expected to feel. He wasn't in control anymore. The mechanic was. And if the man was wrong, everyone on that runway would know it in 30 seconds. The alarm returned like a scream tearing through metal. Passengers inside the cockpit jerked back from the windows as the warning lights burst into a frantic strobe again. The jet shuddered harder this time, a deep vibration rolling through the fuselage like thunder trapped under steel. On the balcony above, the consultant grabbed the railing. The regulator temperature just spiked again. Adrian Vale's jaw tightened. Below, Elias didn't look surprised. He tightened his grip on the wrench and began loosening the bolts on the panel covering the coolant system. 1, 2, 3. Rainwater slid down his sleeves as he worked quickly but without panic. The younger engineer crouched beside him. You're serious about cutting the cockpit power? For 30 seconds, Elias said. That's all the window we need. The engineer glanced toward the jet nervously. If we miscalculate, Elias met his eyes. We won't. That confidence didn't sound arrogant. It sounded practiced. Above them, Vale leaned forward again. You will stop what you're doing immediately, the billionaire barked. Security looked down at the mechanic uncertainly. But the jet shuddered again, louder this time. A long grinding noise echoed from somewhere deep inside the aircraft. Passengers began shouting. The older engineer looked up toward the balcony. Sir, if the coolant pump fails completely, the regulator could overload. Vale snapped. I understand the risk. No, the engineer said quietly. You understand the price of the plane. Silence fell for a split second. Vale's expression darkened. Below, Elias pulled the panel loose. Steam hissed faintly from inside the compartment. The younger engineer recoiled. That's overheating already. Exactly, Elias said. Inside the cavity, the coolant pump vibrated violently against its mounting bracket, jerking every few seconds like a heart struggling to beat. The mechanic studied it for a moment. Then he sighed. Pump's dying. Can we replace it? The younger engineer asked quickly. Elias shook his head. No spare on sight, the man's face went pale. Then what do we? We bypass it, the engineer blinked. With what? Elias reached into his tool belt again. He pulled out a short braided hose and a pair of pressure clamps. The younger engineer stared. You carry coolant bypass equipment in a maintenance belt? Elias shrugged. Old habit. Up on the balcony, the consultant whispered urgently to Vale. If he reroutes the coolant flow manually, it might hold long enough to stabilize the regulator. Vale rubbed his temples. This is absurd. But the alarm screamed again, and this time the plane's left engine coughed violently. Passengers inside the cockpit lurched sideways. The sound of panic spread across the runway. The billionaire looked down at the mechanic again. For the first time that night, he didn't see a stubborn employee. He saw the only person moving toward the problem while everyone else debated it. Below, Elias slid the bypass hose into place with precise movements. Rain soaked the back of his shirt. The engineers watched him work with growing amazement. "You've done this before," the older one murmured. Elias tightened the final clamp. "Something like it." The younger engineer hesitated. "Where?" For a brief moment, Elias didn't answer, because the sound of that failing pump had pulled a memory from somewhere deep in his mind. A desert runway, an aircraft bleeding fuel, a countdown shouted over military radios. He pushed the memory away and focused on the present. "Doesn't matter," he said quietly. He reached toward the wiring harness above the pump. "Now we cut cockpit power for 30 seconds. The younger engineer swallowed hard. "That's a big risk." Elias glanced toward the cockpit window. Inside, frightened faces looked back, including a woman clutching the armrest with white knuckles. Someone important. Someone Vale cared about. The mechanic looked back at the engineer. "The bigger risk is doing nothing." Up on the balcony, Vale's voice cracked across the runway again. "If you shut down that cockpit display, I will personally have you removed from this airport." Elias finally looked up. Rain streaked across his face. "Then you might want to start removing people now," he said calmly. "Because the regulator hits meltdown in 8 minutes." The consultant gasped quietly beside Vale. 8? The billionaire stared down at the mechanic. The man didn't look afraid, didn't look impressed, didn't even look angry. He just looked certain. Below, Elias reached for the manual override switch. The younger engineer's voice trembled. 30 seconds exactly? 30. Then we bring auxiliary current online? Elias nodded. "You're learning." The engineer inhaled sharply. Above them, Adrian Vale finally realized something terrifying. The mechanic he'd tried to pay to walk away wasn't improvising. He was executing a plan that sounded disturbingly familiar to the consultant beside him. The man leaned closer to Vale and whispered, "That bypass method, it's used in military emergency procedures." Vale blinked. "Military?" The consultant nodded slowly. Yes, below, Elias's hand hovered over the override switch. The rain fell harder. Passengers inside the jet watched through the windows, and the billionaire realized something he had never expected to feel. He wasn't in control anymore. The mechanic was. And if the man was wrong, everyone on that runway would know it in 30 seconds. The mechanic's thumb hovered over the manual override switch. Rain hammered against the fuselage now, drumming across the runway like a warning clock ticking down. The alarms inside the aircraft pulsed again, louder, angrier. "Ready?" Elias asked quietly. The younger engineer nodded, though his face had gone pale. "The cockpit display will go dark," he said into his headset, voice shaking slightly. "Stand by for manual auxiliary routing." Inside the jet, the pilot's voice crackled faintly through the open channel. "Say again, why are we cutting power?" Elias spoke toward the headset without raising his voice. "Because your regulator's about to melt." Silence answered him. Then the pilot muttered something that sounded like a prayer. Elias looked at the engineer one last time. 30 seconds. The man swallowed hard. 30. Elias flipped the switch. Instantly, the cockpit lights vanished. Every screen went black. Inside the jet, passengers gasped as the control panels died at once. On the balcony above, guests recoiled. What just happened? Did the plane lose power? Is that supposed to happen? Adrian Vale gripped the railing. What did he just do? The consultant beside him leaned over the glass. He cut cockpit systems to relieve the regulator load. Vale snapped. That sounds incredibly dangerous. Only if the auxiliary current doesn't come back online in time. Down below, the younger engineer was already moving. His hands flew across a portable power terminal attached to the aircraft's underside. Auxiliary reroute. Reroute. The screen flickered. 10 seconds. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's voice came over the headset again. We've lost all display. Working on it, the engineer muttered. 15 seconds. The regulator housing inside the panel hissed as coolant rushed through Elias's newly installed bypass line. He leaned closer, listening. The vibration had slowed, but not enough yet. 20 seconds. The engineer slapped a cable connection into place. Come on, 25. Up on the balcony, Vale felt his heart pounding harder than he liked. He had built companies worth billions, controlled markets, controlled rooms. But right now everything depended on a mechanic with a wrench. 28 seconds. Then the cockpit screens flared back to life. Inside the aircraft, the pilot shouted. Displays restored. A cheer burst from the passengers inside. Down on the runway, the younger engineer sagged with relief. It worked. Elias nodded once. But he didn't celebrate. He was still staring at the regulator housing. The hiss had softened. The metal glow fading slowly, but not completely. The older engineer crouched beside him, temperatures dropping. Good, Elias said, but not fast enough. Both engineers froze. What do you mean? The mechanic pointed at the regulator casing. Damage already started. The younger one looked at the temperature reading again. If it overheats again, Elias finished the sentence calmly. The entire avionics system could cascade. Above them, Vale felt the room shift again. First, the mechanic stabilized the plane. Now he was the only one explaining what might happen next. The billionaire hated losing narrative control. He turned sharply to the consultant. You said he fixed it. I said he bought time. How much time? The consultant hesitated. Maybe 5 minutes. Vale exhaled sharply. This is unbelievable. Down on the runway, Elias tightened the last clamp on the bypass hose. All right, he said. Now we deal with the real problem. The engineers looked at him. We thought that was the problem. Elias wiped his hands again. That was the symptom. He tapped the regulator housing. Something upstream overheated this system in the first place. The younger engineer frowned, but diagnostics didn't show anything. Because diagnostics read electrical signals, Elias replied. Not mechanical stress. The man stared at him. You're saying a mechanical failure started all this? Elias nodded toward the engine mount. Somewhere in there, the older engineer blinked. That's a massive inspection job, yeah, Elias said. And we've got about 4 minutes before this regulator cooks again. Both engineers looked toward the engine. Then back at him. Where do we even start? Elias stepped toward the engine housing slowly. Rain splashed against the metal cowling. He closed his eyes briefly and listened again. The same way he had earlier. The rhythm of the jet, the hum of systems fighting each other. Then he pointed. There. The younger engineer squinted. You heard that? Yep, what is it? Elias opened the panel slightly. A grinding sound echoed faintly from inside. He nodded to himself. Coolant drive shaft, the engineer blinked. That's buried behind 3 layers of engine shielding. Exactly. Above them, Adrian Vale's patience snapped. He grabbed the balcony microphone again. This circus ends now. His voice thundered across the runway. You've had your moment, mechanic. He pointed down toward Elias. Step away from the aircraft immediately. The runway fell silent. Rain still falling. Passengers watching. Engineers frozen. The mechanic slowly straightened. Then he looked up at the billionaire again. "Can't," Vale's voice sharpened. "And why not?" Elias gestured toward the open engine panel. "Because your coolant drive shaft is failing." The consultant gasped beside Vale. The billionaire blinked. "What does that mean?" Below, Elias answered calmly. "It means the real problem isn't fixed yet." The rain poured harder across the runway. And somewhere inside the jet, the damaged shaft groaned again, a sound that meant the next failure was already coming. The grinding sound from inside the engine compartment grew louder. Not enough for the crowd on the balcony to notice, but loud enough for the three men crouched beside the aircraft to feel it vibrating through the metal. The younger engineer swallowed. "That shaft drives the coolant circulation system," he said slowly. "Yeah," Elias replied. "And if it snaps?" The mechanic didn't soften the truth. "The regulator overheats again." The older engineer frowned. "That would trigger the avionics cascade you mentioned." Elias nodded once. "Exactly." Up on the balcony, Adrian Vale lowered the microphone, frustration simmering in his chest. The consultant beside him spoke quietly. "If the drive shaft fails, the regulator meltdown could disable navigation and engine systems simultaneously." Vale stared down at the runway. "Can it be repaired?" The consultant hesitated. "Normally, no. That's a hangar-level repair." Vale exhaled sharply. "But we're not in a hangar. Below, the mechanic leaned deeper into the engine housing. Rainwater slid along the metal cowling as he traced the vibration with his fingertips. The shaft wasn't broken yet, but the bearing supporting it had already warped. Another few minutes and the friction would destroy it. The younger engineer crouched closer. "You really think you can reach it?" Elias nodded toward the shielding layers. "If we remove 2 panels and loosen the drive bracket, maybe." The engineer blinked. "That's still buried behind turbine housing." "Yep. And the tools for that aren't exactly." Elias held up the wrench in his hand. Close enough, the 2 engineers stared at him. Because this sounded less like a guess and more like someone recalling a procedure. The older engineer finally asked the question sitting in both their minds. "You ever worked on military aircraft?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He reached into the engine compartment and gently rotated the coolant shaft by hand. The grinding worsened slightly. "Yep," he said quietly. Both engineers froze. "What kind?" Elias stepped back from the engine and wiped his hands again. The rain had soaked his sleeves completely now. "Avionics and emergency systems." The younger engineer blinked. "That's specialized work." "Was," Elias corrected. Above them, the consultant leaned closer to the railing. "He just confirmed it," the man whispered. Vale frowned. "Confirmed what?" "That he's former military avionics." The billionaire's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me the mechanic I offered $1 million to leave is an aircraft systems specialist?" "Former one." Vale looked back down at the runway again. Below, Elias was already loosening the outer engine panel bolts. Metal clanked softly as the panel shifted. The younger engineer stepped closer. "Why would someone with that background be doing ground maintenance?" The mechanic shrugged. "Life." The older engineer tilted his head. "That's not much of an explanation." Elias smiled faintly. "It's the honest one." The panel came loose. Hot air rushed out of the compartment. The grinding noise grew clearer now. Definitely the shaft, definitely close to failure. The younger engineer crouched beside him again. "You think we can stabilize it?" Elias leaned inside, studying the warped bearing. For a moment his expression changed, not fear, calculation. He had seen this failure before, in places where failure meant much worse than a delayed flight. He exhaled slowly. "We don't stabilize it." The engineer blinked. "Then what?" "We hold it together long enough for the regulator to cool." The older engineer frowned. That's not a repair. No, Elias agreed. It's survival. Above them, Adrian Vale watched the mechanic reach deeper into the engine assembly. The billionaire's confidence had thinned into something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Because the man below wasn't arguing anymore. He was solving. The consultant spoke again quietly. If he can slow the shaft rotation, the coolant system might hold long enough. Vale rubbed his temple. Then why hasn't anyone else suggested that? The consultant didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was uncomfortable. Most of the people in that terminal had never worked on an aircraft under real pressure. They relied on manuals, on protocols, on teams. But the mechanic below was operating on experience, the kind learned when failure meant lives. Down on the runway, Elias reached into his belt pouch again. This time he pulled out a small steel brace. The younger engineer's eyes widened. You carry engine stabilizers too? Improvised ones. He slid the brace carefully beside the vibrating shaft housing. The metal rattled violently. Hold the bracket, Elias said. The younger engineer grabbed it immediately. The older engineer leaned closer with a flashlight. Rain continued to pour around them. Above them, the balcony crowd had gone silent. Because something had shifted in the air. The mechanic wasn't a nuisance anymore. He was the center of the crisis. Elias tightened the brace slowly. The grinding sound softened slightly. Not gone, but controlled. The younger engineer looked amazed. That's actually reducing the vibration. Good. Elias adjusted the pressure another millimeter. The shaft slowed. The regulator temperature reading dropped another degree. Above them, the consultant whispered. He's stabilizing the drive shaft. Vale exhaled slowly, so the mechanic just prevented the cascade. Yes. The billionaire watched the rain-soaked worker kneeling beside his aircraft, a man he had dismissed less than 15 minutes earlier. And suddenly the question that formed in Vale's mind wasn't about the jet. It was about the man fixing it. Because no ordinary mechanic carried military procedures in his hands, and the realization spread quietly through the balcony crowd. The single dad who refused $1 million might be the only reason that plane wasn't already a fireball on the runway. The grinding inside the engine softened into a strained hum. Not fixed. But no longer seconds away from catastrophe. The younger engineers still held the bracket steady while Elias adjusted the improvised brace by fractions of a turn. Rain ran down the mechanic's wrists and dripped from the wrench onto the runway. Hold it right there, Elias said quietly. The engineer nodded. Got it. The shaft rotated again, slow, controlled. The older engineer watched the regulator temperature reading on the handheld monitor. It's dropping, slowly. Elias exhaled. Good, but he didn't relax. Because a temporary solution in aviation wasn't victory. It was borrowed time. Up on the balcony, Adrian Vale leaned forward over the railing again. The tension in the crowd had changed completely. Earlier they had watched a spectacle. Now they were watching survival. Is the danger over? One guest whispered. The consultant beside Vale shook his head. No. How long until the regulator cools? Vale asked. The consultant glanced at the data streaming across the tablet. If the shaft holds, maybe 10 minutes. Vale frowned. And if it doesn't? The man hesitated. Then the system fails again. Below, Elias carefully tightened the final clamp on the brace. The vibration steadied further. The older engineer let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. That's the smoothest it's been since startup. The younger engineer looked at Elias with open disbelief. You stabilized an engine shaft with a toolbox brace. Elias wiped rain from his face. Improvised stabilization, he corrected. Big difference. The engineer laughed nervously. Right, of course. For a moment the mechanic leaned back on his heels. Rain continued falling across the runway lights. Somewhere above the balcony doors opened again. Soft footsteps hurried across the observation deck. Elias glanced up and saw Lila. His daughter stood near the railing holding the paper cup she'd been carrying earlier. Her eyes were wide with worry, but when she saw him looking, she raised her small fist again in encouragement. "Go, Dad," she mouthed silently. The younger engineer followed Elias's gaze. "Your kid?" "Yep, she's been up there this whole time?" "Waiting for my shift to end." The engineer looked up again. "She seems pretty confident you've got this." Elias smiled faintly. "She always does." Up on the balcony, Vale noticed the exchange. "Who's the child?" he asked. The consultant glanced down. "Looks like the mechanic's daughter." Vale stared. Even in the rain, the man below had kept working without hesitation, while a little girl watched him like he was the most capable person in the world. The billionaire felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. Respect, or maybe discomfort. Because that kind of faith usually came from seeing someone do impossible things before. Down below, the regulator monitor beeped softly. The older engineer studied the numbers. Temperature down another 2 degrees. "Good," Elias said. But then he looked back toward the engine housing again, listening. Always listening. The younger engineer noticed. "What is it?" Elias tilted his head slightly. "Something still isn't right." Both engineers froze. "You're kidding," the younger one said. "Nope." He pointed deeper into the engine compartment. "The shaft's stable, but the bearing alignment's still off." The older engineer frowned. "But the brace fixed the vibration." "It reduced it," Elias said. "Not corrected it." Up on the balcony, Vale's patience thinned again. The plane was still grounded. His event was still disrupted. And the mechanic still controlled the situation. He grabbed the microphone once more. "Enough," the billionaire said loudly. "You've had your moment." The runway fell silent again. Vale gestured sharply toward Elias. "The aircraft appears stable now." Elias looked up slowly. Rain dripped from his chin. "It's not stable." Vale ignored him. "My engineers will complete the repair in a controlled environment." The younger engineer glanced nervously at Elias, because that wasn't true. Not yet. The mechanic stood slowly. "Your shaft bearing's still misaligned." Vale's voice hardened. "That's not your decision to make." Elias wiped his hands on the rag again. Then he looked up toward the balcony. "You want the truth?" Vale folded his arms. "Go ahead." The mechanic pointed calmly toward the aircraft engine. "If that bearing shifts another millimeter, the brace won't hold." The consultant beside Vale inhaled sharply. "Is that possible?" Elias answered evenly. In about 6 minutes, the rain fell harder across the runway. Passengers still watched through the cockpit windows. The 2 engineers looked between the billionaire and the mechanic, because one of them controlled authority, and the other controlled reality. Vale's expression hardened. 6 minutes is more than enough time to get you off my runway." Elias shook his head slightly. "No." The billionaire's voice sharpened. "And why not?" The mechanic glanced toward the cockpit windows, then toward the balcony where his daughter still stood, and finally back at the aircraft. "Because when that bearing shifts," his voice stayed calm, "this whole jet will shake itself apart." The silence that followed was deeper than before, and somewhere inside the engine the damaged bearing clicked once, a sound that meant the countdown had already started. The sharp click inside the engine echoed through the metal frame like a warning bell. Elias heard it immediately. The younger engineer heard it a second later. The older engineer felt it through the bracket he was still holding. All 3 men froze. "That wasn't good," the younger engineer whispered. Elias shook his head slowly. No, it wasn't. The brace had slowed the shaft, but the warped bearing inside the engine was still grinding itself into a worse alignment with every rotation. Above them on the balcony, Adrian Vale watched the mechanic's expression change, and he didn't like what he saw. The man looked calm, but not relieved. The consultant beside Vale glanced down at his tablet again. The regulator temperature dropped slightly, he said, but shaft vibration just increased. Vale rubbed his temples. You told me the situation was stabilizing. It was, the consultant replied, but something shifted inside the engine. Down on the runway, Elias leaned closer to the housing again. The click repeated, metal touching metal where it shouldn't. He exhaled, bearing collars slipping. The younger engineer looked stunned. How do you even hear that through all this rain? Elias shrugged slightly. You learn what trouble sounds like. The older engineer tightened his grip on the bracket. What happens if it slips all the way? Elias didn't hesitate. The shaft drops. And then? The coolant line disconnects. The younger engineer's eyes widened. That would dump pressure across the regulator. Yep. And the avionics cascade starts again. Exactly. Up on the balcony, the consultant whispered something quickly into Vale's ear. The billionaire's face hardened. Below, Elias climbed halfway into the engine compartment again. Rain poured down his back. He reached deeper inside, adjusting the brace with delicate pressure. But the grinding continued. Different now. Sharper. He pulled his arm back out slowly. It's moving faster than I thought. The younger engineer stared. How much time do we have? Elias looked at the engine once more. 3 minutes. The engineer's face drained of color. That's not enough time to get replacement parts. Not trying to. Elias replied. The older engineer frowned. Then what are we doing? Elias glanced toward the equipment cart sitting 20 feet away. Improvising again, he walked toward the cart quickly. Tools clanked as he searched through the drawers. The younger engineer followed. What exactly are we improvising? Elias pulled out a narrow steel tension rod, then a heavy locking clamp. Temporary shaft support, the engineer blinked. That's not aviation equipment. Nope. Will it work? Elias looked back toward the engine. It'll hold the shaft long enough for the regulator to cool. Hopefully. Up on the balcony, Vale's patience snapped again. He grabbed the microphone. This situation has gone on long enough. His voice thundered across the runway. I am authorizing full evacuation of the aircraft and shutdown of all systems. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Below, Elias stopped walking. The younger engineer looked at him. If they shut down the engine suddenly, Elias finished the thought. The shaft could snap instantly. The older engineer turned pale. That would rupture the coolant system. Elias nodded, and then you'd have a real emergency. Above them, the consultant spoke urgently to Vale. Sir, a hard shutdown might actually trigger the failure he warned about. Vale clenched his jaw. You're saying we're trapped following the mechanic's plan? I'm saying his plan is currently the only one preventing the cascade. Below, Elias returned to the engine housing with the tension rod and clamp. The younger engineer stared at the equipment. You're building a second brace? Not exactly. He crouched beside the panel again. I'm going to support the shaft from the opposite side. The older engineer blinked. You're rebalancing the bearing load. Elias nodded once. That might stop the collar from slipping. Rainwater streamed down the engine, cowling as he slid the rod carefully into position. The metal rattled violently for a moment. The younger engineer held his breath. Then Elias tightened the clamp. The grinding noise softened again. Not gone, but controlled. The regulator monitor beeped, temperature dropping. The older engineer stared at the numbers. It's working. Elias adjusted the clamp another millimeter. The shaft steadied further. Up on the balcony, the consultant exhaled slowly. He's stabilizing the shaft again. Vale stared down at the mechanic. The rain-soaked worker kneeling beside his aircraft. The man he'd tried to pay to walk away. And the billionaire realized something that unsettled him more than the crisis itself. He had built an empire believing money solved everything. But tonight money had done nothing. Authority had done nothing. Titles had done nothing. A mechanic with a toolbox had done everything. Down on the runway, Elias leaned back slightly and watched the regulator reading fall another degree. Still not safe, but closer. The younger engineer looked at him with awe. "I don't understand how you're doing this." Elias wiped rain from his face again. "Experience. Where did you get that kind of experience?" For the first time that night, Elias hesitated. Then he answered quietly. "Air Force." The engineer blinked. "You were a military avionics engineer?" Elias nodded. Among other things, above them Vale heard the words clearly through the microphone still hanging open. Air Force. The billionaire slowly lowered the device, because suddenly the mechanic's calm confidence made terrifying sense. The man kneeling beside the jet hadn't just learned aircraft systems in a maintenance shop. He had learned them where mistakes cost lives. And that realization spread quietly through the entire balcony. The single dad they watched in the rain wasn't just fixing a plane. He was doing what he had been trained to do under pressure. Save everyone on it. The second brace was held. For the first time since the alarms began screaming across the runway, the engine vibration settled into something steady. Not perfect, nothing about the situation was perfect, but stable enough that the grinding noise softened into a dull mechanical hum. Elias leaned back slightly, studying the regulator monitor. The temperature was still high. But now it is falling. Slowly. The younger engineer wiped rain from his face and stared at the numbers. "It's dropping faster now," he said. "Yeah," Elias replied quietly. The older engineer let go of the bracket he'd been holding for nearly 10 minutes. His hands trembled slightly as blood returned to his fingers. "Never thought I'd see someone stabilize an engine shaft with 2 improvised braces." Elias gave a small shrug. Aircraft don't care where the solution comes from. Above them, the balcony crowd had fallen completely silent. Guests who arrived expecting a luxury charity event now watched a rain-soaked mechanic command the most important space on the runway. Adrian Vale stood motionless at the railing. His microphone hung forgotten in his hand. Because the story unfolding beneath him no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the man kneeling beside the jet. The consultant leaned toward him quietly. "The regulator temperature is continuing to fall." Vale nodded slowly. "So the crisis is ending?" "Not yet," the consultant replied. The billionaire frowned. "What now?" "If the bearing collar slips again before the regulator cools, the entire stabilization could fail." Vale looked back toward the mechanic. The man had already turned toward the engineers again. Down on the runway, Elias wiped his hands and studied the engine housing one more time. The braces were holding. But the pressure inside the coolant system was still fluctuating. He looked toward the younger engineer. "How fast can we drop the regulator load?" The engineer blinked. "You mean reduce system demand?" "Exactly." "Well, we could shut down non-essential avionics." Elias nodded. "Do it." The engineer grabbed his tablet quickly. Moments later, the cockpit radio crackled again. "This is the pilot," the voice said nervously. "What's happening down there?" Elias stepped closer to the open panel. "Cooling your regulator." A pause followed. Then the pilot exhaled. "Who am I talking to?" "Maintenance." The pilot sounded confused. "Maintenance?" "Yeah." Another pause. "Well, maintenance just saved our lives." Elias didn't respond. Compliments didn't matter yet. He kept watching the engine shaft, listening, feeling the rhythm through the braces. The younger engineer spoke up again, non-essential avionics powering down, several lights across the aircraft dimmed, the regulator monitor beeped softly, temperature falling faster now. The older engineer looked stunned. That might actually get us under safe levels. Elias nodded once. That's the goal. Above them, Adrian Vale turned to the consultant again. You're telling me the plane is being saved by a man I tried to pay off 15 minutes ago? The consultant didn't answer. Because the truth was obvious. Below, the mechanic leaned against the engine housing for a moment. Rain ran down the runway in shining streaks under the floodlights. His arms ached, his shoulders burned from holding awkward positions inside the aircraft compartments. But he ignored the fatigue. He had endured worse. The younger engineer watched him carefully. You've done this before, he said quietly. Elias didn't answer. The engineer pressed further. Not just aircraft repairs. Crisis repairs. The mechanic glanced toward the cockpit windows. Passengers still watched through the glass. Some of them had their phones pressed against the windows, filming the scene below. Yeah, Elias admitted. More than once, the older engineer tilted his head. Military emergency response? Something like that. The engineer studied him with new respect. That explains the confidence. Elias shook his head slightly. It's not confidence, what is it? Knowing panic makes things worse. Above them, Vale's gaze shifted toward the balcony entrance. A small figure stood near the doorway. Leela. The little girl still held her paper cup. She hadn't moved since the crisis started. But now she was watching the runway with fierce concentration. The billionaire glanced toward her. That child believes he's going to succeed. The consultant followed his gaze. Children usually know their parents well. Vale looked back toward the mechanic, rain pouring down his shoulders, hands steady, voice calm. The man didn't look like someone hoping to succeed. He looked like someone who already knew how. Down below, the regulator monitor beeped again. The older engineers stared at the display. Temperature dropping into the safe range, the younger one looked at Elias. 2 more minutes and we're clear. Elias nodded slowly. But he didn't move away from the engine. Not yet. Because he had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment in any crisis was when people thought it was already over. And somewhere deep inside the engine, the damaged bearing shifted slightly again. Just enough for him to hear it, a faint scrape, barely noticeable, but real. Elias leaned forward instantly. The younger engineer noticed. What is it? The mechanic exhaled slowly. Nothing yet. Then he tightened the clamp another fraction of a turn. Just in case, because the difference between success and disaster often came down to one final adjustment. And he wasn't about to let that final moment slip away. The faint scrape inside the engine returned. Soft. Almost polite. But Elias heard it instantly. His hand froze on the clamp. The younger engineer noticed the change in his posture. What is it? The mechanic didn't answer right away. He leaned closer to the engine housing again, listening through the rain and humming machinery. The scrape came again, a thin metallic whisper. Bearing collar, Elias murmured. The younger engineer's face tightened. I thought we stabilized it. We slowed it, Elias corrected quietly. The older engineer looked down at the regulator monitor. Temperature's almost in the safe zone. How long? Elias asked. Maybe 60 seconds. The mechanic nodded. But his eyes never left the engine, because the scrape meant the bearing was still shifting under load, just barely, but enough. Above them on the balcony, Adrian Vale leaned forward again. Why did he stop moving? The billionaire asked. The consultant squinted down at the runway. Something changed. Vale exhaled impatiently. Of course something changed. Below, Elias tightened the clamp a fraction more. The metal groaned softly. The shaft steadied again, for now. The younger engineer watched him closely. You heard something we didn't... Yeah. What? The collar trying to slip again. The engineer's stomach dropped. But the regulator is cooling. Exactly, Elias said. If the shaft fails now, the coolant pressure surge could spike the system one last time. The older engineer's eyes widened. That could restart the cascade, yep. How long until the regulator is fully safe? 30 seconds, the engineer replied. Elias nodded slowly. Then he reached back into the engine housing again. The rain poured harder now, bouncing off the aircraft's metal skin. His fingers found the shaft collar. It vibrated under his touch. Barely stable, but still turning. The younger engineer leaned closer. What are you doing? Feeling the rotation. You can actually tell that by touch? Elias nodded. Sometimes. Up on the balcony, Vale turned toward the consultant again. I want to understand something. Yes? How is a mechanic doing things my entire aviation team hasn't suggested? The consultant hesitated. Because he isn't thinking like a maintenance technician. Vale frowned. Then what is he thinking like? The man answered quietly. A combat systems engineer. The billionaire looked back toward the runway again. And suddenly the image changed in his mind. The man below wasn't just fixing a plane, he was managing a battlefield. Every vibration, every second, every risk. Down on the runway, the regulator monitor beeped again. The older engineer leaned closer to the screen. Temperature entering safe range, the younger engineer exhaled loudly. That's it, but Elias didn't celebrate. He was still holding the shaft collar between his fingers. The scrape came again, louder. The brace creaked under the shifting load. The younger engineer froze. That didn't sound good. Elias spoke calmly. Because it wasn't. How long do we need to hold it? The older engineer glanced at the monitor again. 15 seconds, the mechanic nodded. Then he slid his arm deeper into the engine housing. The younger engineer blinked. What are you doing? Stopping the collar with your hand? Just guiding it, that shaft is rotating slowly. The younger engineer looked horrified. That could break your wrist. Elias shrugged. Only if I panic. Up on the balcony, the consultant leaned forward suddenly. He's inside the housing. Vale blinked. What? The consultant pointed. He's stabilizing the collar manually. The billionaire stared. You mean he put his hand into a running engine? Yes. Below, Elias braced his arm carefully against the engine frame. His fingers pressed against the collar's edge. The vibration pulsed through his bones, not violent, but relentless. The younger engineer stared at him in disbelief. You're insane. Elias smiled faintly. No, he kept his voice steady. Just patient. The regulator monitor beeped again. The older engineer leaned closer. 10 seconds, rain streamed down the aircraft. The shaft turned slowly beneath Elias's hand. The scrape softened. 5 seconds. 4, 3. The regulator temperature finally dropped below the red threshold. The monitor chirped. Safe range. Elias slowly withdrew his hand. The shaft continued rotating, stable now under the reduced load. The braces held. The grinding noise faded completely. Silence settled across the runway. The younger engineer stared at him. You just held an engine shaft in place with your hand. Elias flexed his fingers once. Wouldn't recommend it. Above them, the consultant exhaled. The system is stabilized. Vale stared down at the mechanic. The rain-soaked man standing beside the jet. the man he had offered $1 million to leave. The passengers inside the cockpit began cheering. Their voices echoed faintly across the runway. Down below, the younger engineer looked at Elias with something close to awe. "You didn't just fix the plane," he said quietly. "You saved everyone on it." Elias glanced briefly toward the balcony, where his daughter still stood watching. Then he looked back at the aircraft. "Just did my job," but above them Adrian Vale realized something the entire room now understood. The quiet single dad he tried to dismiss was the only reason his plane and the people he loved were still alive. For a long moment, no one moved. Rain still fell across the runway, tapping softly against the aircraft wings and pooling beneath the floodlights. The engine hummed in a steady rhythm now. No grinding, no scraping. Just the smooth rotation that should have been there from the start. Inside the cockpit, passengers were still cheering. Some pressed their palms against the windows, waving down toward the runway where the mechanic stood beside the open engine panel. The younger engineer exhaled shakily. "I can't believe that actually worked." Elias closed the engine hatch carefully and tightened the final bolts. "Aircraft don't care about belief," he said quietly. "They care about physics." The older engineer laughed softly, relief washing through his voice. Fair enough. Above them, the balcony crowd finally erupted into applause. It started with a few scattered claps, then more. Soon the entire viewing gallery was filled with the sound. Investors, guests, pilots, executives, all clapping for the man they had ignored 20 minutes earlier. Elias glanced up briefly, surprised by the noise. Applause had never meant much to him. But one voice stood out above the rest. "That's my dad." Leela's small shout cut through the rain. She leaned over the balcony railing, her cup of hot chocolate forgotten on the floor behind her. The mechanic smiled faintly. The younger engineer followed his gaze. "That's a proud kid, yeah," Elias said. "She is." Up on the balcony, Adrian Vale stood frozen, while the applause echoed around him. He hadn't clapped, not yet, because his mind was still replaying the moment that changed everything. The moment the mechanic refused his $1 million offer. The consultant beside him finally spoke. "You should probably say something." Vale blinked. "About what?" The consultant gestured toward the runway. "The man who just saved your aircraft, and everyone inside it." Vale looked back down. Elias was closing his toolbox now, rain dripping from the edge of the jet's wing above him. The engineers beside him were still talking animatedly, clearly amazed by what they had just witnessed. Vale took a slow breath, then he lifted the microphone again. The applause faded as the billionaire's voice carried across the runway. "Ladies and gentlemen." The crowd quieted. Vale looked down at the mechanic. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier arrogance. "The aircraft is now stable." A few people nodded. Passengers inside the cockpit continued cheering. Vale paused. Then he continued. "But let's be honest about something." He gestured toward Elias. "That stability did not come from money." Silence settled across the balcony. The billionaire swallowed once, because saying the next words meant admitting something he had never admitted publicly before. "I offered that man $1 million to walk away from this situation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Vale continued. "And he refused." He looked directly at Elias now. "In front of all of you." The mechanic stood quietly beside the aircraft, rain dripping from his sleeves. Vale exhaled slowly, and if he had accepted that offer, the billionaire paused. The implication hung heavily in the air. The consultant finished the thought quietly beside him. The plane would have failed. Vale nodded once. Yes, he lowered the microphone slightly, then lifted it again. "So I'd like to correct something I said earlier. The runway was completely silent now. Vale's voice carried clearly through the rain. "That man is not just a mechanic." He gestured toward Elias again. "He is the reason my family and everyone on that aircraft are still alive tonight." A second wave of applause erupted across the balcony, stronger this time. Real. Elias shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. The younger engineer nudged him gently. "You should probably say something." The mechanic shook his head. "Not really my thing." Up on the balcony, Vale continued speaking. "And I also learned something tonight." He paused. The billionaire rarely admitted learning anything. Sometimes the most valuable person in the room. He gestured toward the service area where Elias stood. His standing in the place, no one important thought to look. The applause grew louder again. Leela clapped harder than anyone. Below, Elias finally grabbed his toolbox. The crisis was over. The plane was safe. And his shift was technically finished. He began walking toward the maintenance corridor. The younger engineer called after him. "Wait, where are you going?" Elias shrugged over his shoulder. "Clocking out." The engineer blinked. "You just saved a multi-million-dollar jet." "Yep. And you're just leaving?" Elias nodded. "Kid's been waiting for hot chocolate for an hour." Up on the balcony, Vale watched the mechanic walk away from the runway. The man didn't look back, didn't soak in the applause, didn't even pause. And for the first time in years, Adrian Vale realized something about power. Real power didn't need an audience. Sometimes it just fixes the problem. And went home to its daughter. Rain had softened to a mist by the time Elias reached the maintenance corridor. Behind him, the runway lights still glowed against the wet concrete, reflecting the aircraft that now sat quiet and stable under the floodlights. The cheers from the balcony had faded into distant chatter, but the story of what had happened out there was already spreading through the terminal. Inside the corridor, the air smelled faintly of oil and warm machinery. Elias set his toolbox down beside the locker bench and rolled his shoulders once. The tension that had carried him through the last 20 minutes finally began to loosen in his muscles. Footsteps hurried behind him. "Hey." The younger engineer jogged into the corridor, slightly out of breath. "You really weren't kidding, you were just leaving." Elias gave a small shrug. Shifts over, the engineer shook his head in disbelief. "You just stabilized an engine shaft with 2 improvised braces and your bare hand." "Yeah. And stopped a systems cascade that could have destroyed the aircraft." "Sounds dramatic when you say it like that." The engineer laughed. "It was dramatic." He leaned against the locker beside Elias. "So, Air Force avionics? Used to be. What happened?" Elias closed his locker slowly. "Life." The engineer studied him for a moment. "That's the same answer you gave earlier, still the honest one." From the end of the corridor, another set of footsteps approached. Slower this time. Elias didn't need to look to know who it was. Adrian Vale stopped a few steps away. The billionaire wasn't wearing the confident smile he usually carried in front of cameras. He looked thoughtful, maybe even a little humbled. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Vale cleared his throat. "I suppose I owe you something." Elias picked up his toolbox. "You already offered." Vale shook his head. That wasn't the same thing. The mechanic met his eyes. No, it wasn't. Vale took another breath. "When I offered you that money, I assumed something." Elias waited. "That everyone has a price." The corridor stayed quiet, except for the faint hum of the airport beyond the walls. "And tonight," Vale continued slowly, "I realized something." "What's that?" "Some people don't." Elias adjusted his grip on the toolbox. "Some things matter more than money," Vale nodded. "Like the passengers on that plane." "Like the passengers on that plane, and like your daughter." The mechanic's expression softened slightly. Yeah, at the end of the corridor, a small pair of footsteps suddenly rushed forward. Dad, Leela ran straight into him, nearly knocking the toolbox from his hand. He laughed quietly and steadied her. "Hey, kid." She looked up at him with wide eyes. "You fixed the airplane? Looks like it. I knew you would." Elias brushed damp hair from her forehead. "Did you now?" She nodded fiercely. "You always fix things." Vale watched the moment quietly. For a man who spent most of his life negotiating billion-dollar deals, the simple scene in front of him felt strangely powerful. The little girl believed her father could solve impossible problems, and tonight she had been right. Vale reached into his coat pocket. The mechanic noticed immediately. "If that's a check," Elias said calmly, "don't bother." The billionaire paused. Then he slowly removed his hand again. "No." He gave a small smile. "I think I finally understand that." The younger engineer looked between them. "So what happens now?" Vale glanced back toward the runway through the glass doors. "The aircraft will be inspected overnight." He turned back toward Elias. "And the mechanic who saved it," Elias raised an eyebrow. "Gets to go home." The little girl tugged on his sleeve. "You promised hot chocolate." "Did I?" "Yep. Well, we can't break that promise." He started walking toward the exit with Lila beside him. Vale called after him once more. "Rowan." Elias stopped but didn't turn around. "Yes?" The billionaire spoke carefully. "I offered you $1 million to walk away tonight." "Yep, and you refused." "Also true." Vale nodded slowly. "I'm glad you did." For a second, Elias said nothing. Then he glanced down at his daughter holding his hand. "Me too." He pushed open the terminal door. Cool night air drifted inside. The runway lights stretched into the distance. Quiet now. Behind him, Adrian Vale stood in the corridor thinking about everything that had happened. The humiliation, the crisis, and the moment a single calm answer silenced an entire room. Sometimes dignity didn't come from wealth or titles. Sometimes it came from a man in work boots who simply refused to abandon people in danger. And sometimes the most powerful lesson in the room came from the person everyone underestimated. If you enjoyed this story, ask me for the next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. The CEO fired the janitor for sitting in his chair. The board's reaction changed everything. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next? "That's my daughter. What did you do to her?" The woman shouted across the mall floor. Security was already moving, hands on radios, eyes locked on the maintenance worker kneeling beside the small girl. The child clutched his sleeve and cried while shoppers slowed to stare. Someone whispered that it looked suspicious, that security should separate them immediately. But the quiet single dad didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply stayed where he was, one steady hand resting on the frightened girl's shoulder. Minutes later, the entire mall would realize they had judged the wrong man. Because sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the only ones ready when things fall apart. Before I show you the exact moment when the maintenance worker saved that child in front of the guards accusing him. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What nobody around them understood was that the quiet worker kneeling on cold tile had spent years running toward emergencies others ran from. They saw a uniform and a toolbox. They didn't see the training buried behind a life that had been rebuilt after loss. The little girl kept crying, small fingers twisted in the fabric of his sleeve. "Hey kid, it's okay," he murmured softly, lowering himself closer so she didn't have to look up at the crowd. Escalator motors hummed above them, and the smell of cinnamon pretzels drifted through the bright atrium. None of it seemed to reach the trembling child. He had already scanned the surroundings the way old instincts demanded. No parent in sight, no frantic voice calling her name, just shoppers watching and security boots approaching fast. "Sir, step away from the child." The security supervisor's voice cut through the murmuring crowd. He looked up calmly, but didn't move his hand from the girl's shoulder. "She's lost," he said quietly. "Found her near the fountain." The supervisor frowned, clearly unconvinced. Two more guards formed a loose circle as curious shoppers slowed their steps. The child tightened her grip again. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, voice shaking. The words hit him harder than the suspicion in the guard's eyes. He leaned closer. "Hey, nobody's taking you anywhere, all right?" Calm, steady, the same tone he once used in far louder places. Footsteps clicked sharply across marble as the girl's mother pushed through the crowd. "Leela." The woman rushed forward, expensive heels echoing, panic blazing across her face. Security straightened instantly. One guard gestured toward the kneeling maintenance worker. "That's my daughter. What happened?" Her eyes moved from the child to the man beside her and hardened. Suspicion arrived before gratitude. She was alone, he said, just trying to keep her calm. The mother pulled the girl toward her, protective arms wrapping tight. But the child suddenly swayed. Her small body went strangely limp. Ethan felt the change instantly. Years of training stirred before thought. The girl's breathing sounded wrong. Too shallow. Too fast. "Ma'am, something's not right." The mother froze, confusion cutting through her anger. "What do you mean?" she demanded. He was already reaching for the child's wrist. Pulse racing. Too irregular. Around them radios crackled and the crowd pressed closer. The supervisor spoke into his mic. "Get medical down here." But the maintenance worker's attention never left the child. He lowered her gently to the floor before anyone could object. The mother stared in stunned silence. Authority meant nothing against the quiet certainty in his movements. Shoppers held their breath. Somewhere an alarm chimed from a distant storefront. The mall suddenly felt too bright, too loud, too small. He tilted the girl's head carefully, listening. "Stay with us, kid, just breathe." The mother knelt beside them, fear replacing suspicion. Is she going to be okay?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on the rhythm of the child's breathing. Old memories flickered at the edges of his mind. Desert heat, helicopter blades, voices shouting for a medic. He pushed the memories away. She needs space. Security hesitated. Then the supervisor motioned the crowd back. Air moved again around the child. The maintenance worker exhaled slowly. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew this night wasn't over. The girl's breathing hitched again beneath his steady hand. He glanced up at the mother. "Does she have any medical conditions?" The woman blinked, stunned. "Asthma, sometimes." That was enough to confirm his fear. He reached for the small tool pouch hanging from his belt. The supervisor watched carefully now. Suspicion slowly giving way to uncertainty because the man they had been questioning moved with absolute confidence. And somewhere between the humming escalators and the stunned silence of the crowd, the truth about the quiet maintenance worker was about to surface in the next few seconds, everyone watching. The little girl's chest rose and fell too quickly. "Leela, sweetheart, look at me," her mother said, voice trembling as she held the child's hand. But the girl barely reacted. The maintenance worker leaned closer, listening carefully to each breath. It had a faint wheeze buried under the panic, the kind most people would miss in a noisy mall. He didn't miss it. "Does she have an inhaler?" he asked without looking up. The woman blinked, startled by the question. Yes, in my bag." Her hands fumbled through an expensive leather purse, before she pulled out the small inhaler with shaking fingers. He took it gently. "All right, Leela, we're going to help you breathe, okay?" Security Supervisor Darius Holt watched closely now, arms crossed. Only minutes earlier he had been ready to escort the man away from the child. Now he wasn't sure what he was seeing. The worker positioned the inhaler carefully and guided the girl through the motion. "Slow breath, that's it," the girl tried. Her chest shuddered. A thin gasp slipped out. Her mother's panic surged again. "Why isn't it working?" He stayed calm. Sometimes panic makes it worse. He glanced up briefly. "Ambulance coming?" One of the guards spoke into his radio. "Paramedics are on the way." Around them, the crowd had thickened. Phones hovered in the air. Whispers moved like wind. The worker ignored all of it. His attention stayed fixed on the child. He gently lifted her chin again, adjusting her position so her airway stayed clear. The woman watched every movement now with a new kind of fear. "What are you doing?" Helping her breathe. His voice stayed steady. The supervisor stepped closer, kneeling beside them now. "You trained for this, or something?" The worker gave a short nod without looking away from the girl. "Something like that." Another shallow breath rattled from the child. He checked her pulse again, still racing, too fast, but still strong. That mattered. He looked at the mother again. When was her last asthma attack? A few months ago, but never like this. Her voice cracked. The man nodded slowly. "Okay, stay calm." "She needs you calm." The words sounded simple, but they carried quiet authority. Even the security supervisor noticed. The expensive marble floor felt colder by the second as the mother knelt beside them. She held her daughter's hand tighter. "I'm here, baby." The child's eyes fluttered weakly. The worker spoke again, low and steady. "Good, keep talking to her." Footsteps thundered somewhere near the entrance as the mall's medical response team hurried closer. The radio on Holt's shoulder crackled. "Paramedics 2 minutes out." 2 minutes. The man measured the time automatically. 2 minutes could feel like forever when someone couldn't breathe. He shifted slightly, keeping the child upright. Airflow mattered. Small adjustments mattered. Everything mattered. "Leela, take another slow breath for me." The girl tried again. A thin inhale finally filled her lungs a little deeper. Not perfect, but better. The maintenance worker nodded to himself. Good sign. Security Supervisor Holt watched carefully now, confusion slowly replacing suspicion. This wasn't panic, this was control. And that realization unsettled him. A moment earlier he had been questioning the man like a suspect. Now the situation looked very different. The mother noticed it too. She studied the worker's calm hands, the way he monitored the child without hesitation. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. He hesitated. Just a second. Then he gave a simple answer. "Just someone who found your daughter." The girl coughed suddenly. Sharp. Painful. The sound echoed across the atrium. The mother gasped. The worker reacted instantly, guiding the child forward so the cough cleared her airway instead of choking her. "Good, let it out." Another cough followed, then another, each one louder, each one pushing air deeper into her lungs. The crowd collectively exhaled. The girl finally managed a shaky breath. Not perfect, but stronger. The maintenance worker relaxed his shoulders slightly. Paramedics burst through the mall entrance seconds later with a stretcher. Moved back, they quickly knelt beside the child. One medic examined her breathing while the other checked vital signs. Then both looked at the worker. "You stabilized her?" He shrugged lightly. "Just kept her breathing." The medic gave a small, impressed nod. "Good work." The words hung in the air. Security Supervisor Holt noticed the change instantly. The paramedic spoke to the maintenance worker like a colleague. Not a suspect, not a stranger, a professional. The mother noticed it too. Her eyes widened slightly. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked the medic. The medic checked the monitor again. "She's improving." Relief rushed through the crowd like a quiet wave. The child blinked weakly now, breathing steadier. The worker slowly leaned back, giving the medic space. His job here was done. Or at least that's what he thought. But the security supervisor's voice stopped him before he could stand. "Hold on a second." Holt studied him carefully now. The suspicion hadn't vanished, but something else had replaced it. Curiosity. "Where'd you learn to handle a situation like that?" The man wiped his hands quietly on a cloth from his belt pouch. For a moment, he looked like exactly what everyone had assumed. Just a maintenance worker finishing a messy task. Then he answered calmly. "Old job." The supervisor narrowed his eyes. "What kind of job teaches you that?" The worker stood slowly now. The bright mall lights reflected off the polished floors as the crowd continued watching. He met Holt's gaze for only a second. "Combat medicine." The words landed softly. But the silence they created was thunder. Combat medicine. The word settled into the air like a sudden drop in temperature. Security Supervisor Darius Holt stared at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. The paramedic kneeling beside the child glanced up as well, interest flickering across his face. "You serious?" Holt asked. The maintenance worker didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the paramedics attach a monitor to the girl's finger, tracking her oxygen levels. The steady beep of the device cut through the murmuring crowd. Her breathing had slowed, not normal yet, but no longer desperate. That mattered. "Used to be," he finally replied. The paramedic checking her airway looked up again. "Army?" He nodded once. "Yeah." That was all he offered. The mother, Marina Velez, remained kneeling beside her daughter, her hands trembling as she brushed the girl's hair from her forehead. The expensive calm she carried earlier had completely vanished. Now she looked like any terrified parent. "You said combat medicine?" she asked quietly. He shrugged again. "Long time ago," but the paramedic studying the monitor wasn't convinced. "You didn't just learn a little somewhere," he said. "You cleared her airway, stabilized her breathing, and kept her conscious through an asthma crash." He paused. "That's trained work." The worker glanced at him briefly. Kid needed help. That was the only explanation he seemed willing to give. The medic gave a faint smile. Still, good instincts. Another paramedic arrived, pushing the stretcher through the thinning crowd. "Vitals?"